really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for your invitation to be part of this series. It's been a strong passion of mine to be able to see people be able to move past the things that block them. And one of the really big things that I focus a lot on is emotional release. And while in an ideal world is something that is very easy, I do find that there's a lot of limitations that are both personally and through our culture, we do have a tendency to have trouble with moving past, especially strong emotions. So I'd like to kind of go over a little way to just kind of see both what emotions can be in a different context using a different framework and theory, as well as what the process of emotional release and what it can look like using this model. So I want to kind of go over how to face, embrace, and release traumatic and upsetting feelings. We're going to be more focusing today on what happens during a strong emotional trigger. But this method applies to any kind of emotion you like to release. It's just not going to be maybe as immediate of a need. I really see emotions as kind of a separate process to, I guess culturally we do tend to think of it a lot. And I'd like to kind of bring that back into its own process and seeing it kind of at its own level. So in general, I think emotions are considered something that are more put in a sideline. It's a bad thing to be emotional. It is really just something we don't want to do and we avoid. We don't like to cry in public. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying. This is something we don't do well in our culture. But I would like to emphasize that we're more looking at healthy context and healthy outlets for emotions, that there's nothing wrong with the emotions themselves. So think about what it would be like to be able to have a healthy release of your feelings. I think that would be a game changer for a lot of people and the ways that they're uncomfortable and they're suffering. So we're going to talk a little about emotional expression and how to make that healthy. Chantal talked a little bit about looking at things using a Chinese medicine theory. And one of the really interesting things about emotions in Chinese medicine is it's kind of in a continuum of self. I would call our current cultural model the dualistic model, where there's mind and body and they don't really touch. But in Chinese medicine, it's more like a spectrum where you have physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual kind of all connected together. Just one is slightly different context, but they're all kind of seamless to each other. So in that sense, when you're doing something emotional, it is also physical. So you're looking at a physical being and emotional and an emotional being physical. And we have a lot of, I guess, examples of this in our culture, like when somebody's crying, they're sad. When somebody's stressed, they're tight. When someone's angry, their face gets red. And I want that to be an obvious aha on any kind of emotional expression. So every emotion has a physical component. So I want you to just kind of look at this whole process as not something you have to necessarily be good at and do the whole thing completely. I find that a lot of this stuff is new. Sometimes we don't really, even in sessions, we don't necessarily do all of it in one go. You kind of have to warm up to the different concepts and maybe just take each piece kind of separately, see if you can do it, see how it feels to be in the space using these tools, and then see how comfortable you are to combine them together. I mean, ultimately, small steps make for bigger progress in the end. I want you to just think about emotions as a lot of people will have a good and bad concept of emotions. And I would like to just kind of remove that right now. There's no such thing as a bad emotion. There's probably an unhealthy way to express certain emotions, but there's nothing wrong with any emotion. So anger, disappointment, frustration, like fear. There's nothing bad about these emotions. And just anger is anger, fear is fear. And so these are perfectly appropriate to have. And that's part of the process that I'd like to do today, is to just get to a point where you're like, I'm having an emotion. I'm here to be a part of that, but I'm not going to label and judge and kind of stop the process of a release. Like, all emotions are valid. So, I guess sometimes people will have a definition of emotions that aren't necessarily comfortable. So I want to just explain that, like, emotions don't have to be volatile emotions. So anger is anger, but anger is not violence. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, that your label might be part of what's making it uncomfortable. The emotion itself, we're going to try to, I guess, make it more comfortable, a little less intimidating, more approachable, something more manageable. But the label itself could also be causing part of the problem with the expression. So for me, anger is a feeling, but it is also a sensation in my body. And the way someone expresses that anger is different. And that's the part that I would be like, well, I don't have to do it that way. I can do it in a healthier way. And the separating emotions from thinking. This is really an important thing that I'd like to just address, because we don't process emotions by thinking. We kind of, in some ways, delay our ability to work through emotions. Emotions are not, it's almost a delay to have the thoughts. It just kind of, it will make you judgmental of yourself. It'll make things a little bit more uncomfortable. So I want you to just imagine the emotions as something you're observing, you're looking at, you're kind of approaching that way, but you're not actually being in this process. Enough to recognize what it is, but not to say, hey, I'm anger right now. You say, I can see that a part of me is angry, and I'm going to be that perspective rather than the perspective of the being angry. So it's an interesting, like, Chinese medicine is a lot about energy. I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of qi before, but I'm just going to call it energy. There's no real need to go into the theory deeply, but in a lot of ways, your body is energy, and emotions are also energy. So one of the things that I try to relabel emotions to being physical sensations. So the emotion isn't necessarily the muscle, but you can think of the emotion as being the movement of that muscle, or the movement of the voice, or the movement of my body in other ways. It can be kind of a tingling, it can be a tightness, it can be pressure. And the movement and the sensation is what I want to be looking at. We don't have to give the emotion a regular emotion word. We can just talk about pressure in the chest. We don't have to talk about anxiety. That can sometimes help us bring it back out of kind of self-judgment, but also panic attacks can partly be because of, I don't want this to happen. So you're labeling something. So we're bringing it back into just physical sensations. I'm paying attention to myself, and myself is having this strong feeling, this sensation, this motion or movement in my body. And it doesn't have to be the words of an emotion. Typically, we can just talk about the sensation. And I find that really helpful for not judging yourself. So you're having I'm feeling a tightness in my throat. I'm feeling my neck getting hurt, but I'm not anxious. I'm not panicking. Those judgment words can go away. I find if you are interested in the idea of the body using the sensations being kind of a movement, there's an entire field of study called metaphysics. I like to use it as a way to kind of give us a way of communicating the mind with the body. When you're not used to doing it, it's kind of helpful to read up on tension patterns and seeing if they correlate to anything that's going on in your life. So like obvious one is tightness in the neck and shoulders can be related to stress. The metaphysics book will talk about it being related to kind of responsibilities, and too many responsibilities or burdens. And that whole field in itself, a few authors that I used to, a lot of people may have heard of Louise Hay. There's a woman I like from Quebec, Lise Bourbeau, and then there's Jacques Martel. And all of this is just a springboard into getting used to listening to your body rather than your mind when it comes to how you're feeling. You can customize this. And so this doesn't require you to jump on metaphysics. If you don't like it, please don't use it. But it is helpful if you're really confused with how the body can be expressing. I'm at this point, I'm used to the body kind of using these sensations as a way to kind of express itself and talk. So if I'm feeling tight, that tight pattern, depending on the part of my body, might actually be telling me how I'm feeling that I might not be paying attention to. So denial is an interesting concept. I like to think about it as the mind will, when I'm asking myself, how do I feel? The mind will always answer, I'm fine. I consider this an adaptive process because to be fully in honesty about how you're feeling at all times, you might never really accomplish much. It's a survival mechanism. So I never ask my mind how I'm feeling because I don't need to know that I'm fine. I want to know how I'm actually doing. So I will go to my physical symptoms. So my physical symptoms, because I know they're connected to my whole aspect of self, because I believe in a spectrum of self, my physical symptoms will indicate how I'm feeling. So if I'm feeling tight in my neck, if I'm feeling like sore in my gut, it will tell me how I'm feeling more accurately and more honestly. So both as a way to kind of see emotions, but also as a way to talk to myself using the body sensations is very helpful. Some other quick ones will be, so fear often is in the gut. And I find frustration is often in the jaw. I use these quick ones, but you can figure out what each symptom your body goes through might be indicating for yourself. I do have a weird one where my forearms will get really tight when I'm nervous when I'm talking to somebody. And when I start massaging my forearms, I mentally become aware that, oh, I'm uncomfortable. So I need to work on it. And it helps bring awareness to how I'm feeling because I might otherwise not be willing to see the emotion that I'm feeling. I like using the body to be the baseline for release because it's very effective. There's not a lot of things the body expresses with, so it can be a little bit more honest than maybe we're used to being because we play like coping mechanisms with ourselves, but the body is really willing to take care of itself and willing to work on itself. It's just a matter of kind of getting the mind in agreement with that. And so that's actually part of the process that I'll be talking about later, because the mind is kind of the one who directs whether or not we can even make this process work. So we have to get the mind on board, but the physical self is where we do the release. So before I move on, I just want to have, if there's any questions about seeing the body as kind of a place of information about emotions, or seeing if like any of this idea is a little bit confusing for anyone.
So I'm not sure if you're going to cover this later, but someone asked, well, someone said, when I feel anger, it comes out in an explosive way. So I find it hard to just observe it. Is there a way to lower the intensity of that anger?
I will bring that up when we talk about the actual release process. So if you can bring that up again at that point, I think it will fit better at that point, but yes, like that's definitely a very helpful question. We'll definitely cover that. Is there anything other than that?
That was the only question.
Okay, so if anyone has any further questions about like seeing the body as a place of observing the emotions, then please just let Chantal know. I do also just kind of want to, I mentioned before I go, as I guess an outline is that emotions do express themselves differently. I think a lot of people, when we're talking about intense emotions, anger and sadness are the main ones, but like when people cry, that is a type of release. But anger itself, I do find tends to come out in movement. So if you want to try to do movement when you're angry, like pacing or like exercise, or even some chores, like I find it really clean things well when I'm angry. That's kind of facilitating the way the emotion likes to come out, because the movement of energy in the body has a tendency to do certain things. Before, like the only one that I find is not very clear is fear. Releasing fear is a little bit opposite. You do not really release fear directly. You create a safe space where you feel loving and you feel safe, and fear will release. Fear is, if you try to release fear directly, you're going to really tight and nothing will move. So when you you have to create a place where you will be able to relax. So making a loving, safe space is really important for fear release or panic, because you need to feel like you can relax, because the emotions don't move if your muscles don't move. So if you're tight, like when you become really panicked or in fear, you need to take that breath, relax, get back to a place of safety before it will come out. I kind of think about it like melting ice. So the tools that I'm going to talk about today to get to the face, embrace, release, a really important tool is a safe space. Safe space. Without a safe space, I would say it's like being outside in a storm. There's nothing you're going to really be able to accomplish when it comes to moving past something if you don't feel safe in your space. Now, safe space can be an actual space, and it can be a mental space, like a happy place. I find having a little bit of both is really nice. I mean, you're not going to really be able to relax if you're in the middle of a cafeteria with a bunch of people. But if that's the only place that you can do, like you go into your happy place and you work with what you can. But that's ideally for a full release. You do kind of need to have a place you like physically feel safe in. It's going to be full of just gentle music, your favorite things, things that make you comfortable. Like maybe you got some food, and so you're fed, get some water. Just kind of having your basic needs addressed really is really important about making a safe space. It's quiet. There's nothing that's going to pounce in. Like there's nothing unpredictable about your space. You know, you can seal the space off, be in your space. You don't have to be alone. That's not a requirement at all. It's just more that it is a space that makes you feel safe, especially if you've got pets. Bring your pets in, your favorite toy, like, or a blanket, nice hot drink. And then you can also have a safe space, happy place that you go to in your mind. A lot of people will pick something in nature, but you might have like a childhood place that means a lot to you. Or you can just make something up that's like this fantasy. Like I've created a safe space before. I was like in this tropical beach house, and it was beautiful, and there was Zen pools, and I've never been to this place, but I like it in my mind. It seems amazing, and it made me feel very comfortable to go there personally. So I was able to relax because I had this really nice safe space. So the visualizations, everything, it's really helpful to just be aware of your safe space and have a good familiarity with it, because the first few times using a safe space, you're probably just putting your feet in the water. You're not necessarily able to go deep. It is in itself something that can help you relax, help you release pent up feelings. And it can be healing in and of itself to just be in a place of safety for once, for like an hour. And if you want to use that as a regular technique, it's a really nice way to meditate before you go to bed, is to just be aware that I am in a safe space now. So safe space, there's no danger in your safe space. So the things that you're feeling are from yourself, and you know your space is just providing you a place to work through that stuff. And so after you have established a safe space, we then learn how to hold space. Holding space is going back to that concept of observing your feelings. So holding space is, or you can even think of it as taking a step back from yourself. I can also call it grounding. It's being in a place where your safe space is more like active and you're observing the stuff in the space, but not actively engaging in that stuff. So I like to think about it as you've let the dogs out in the yard to play. You're there to watch the dogs stay in the yard, that they don't go running out onto the road. But you yourself are not making the dogs move around. You're just watching them. You're just enjoying the fact that they're out there playing in the yard. They've got a ball. They're having a great time. You're holding space is there for your emotional self to be able to work through and process that release. Holding space is, I guess the way you would practice holding space is I'm having an emotion, let's say it's anger, and I stop and realize that I am having an emotion. I can take a mental step back and watch that anger and not necessarily be the anger, but be a person watching the part of myself that's angry. So I am holding that space in my safe space. And what that does is enable me to have a release. Now, in order to maintain holding space, we do meditative breathing. When someone holds their breath, it's actually a physical signal for being anxious. So that's very important to kind of keep out of that mental space by engaging in the body in a way that helps it relax. There is it's very important to belly breathe rather than breathe with the shoulders. Belly breathing will activate the vagus nerve. It'll help the parasympathetic nervous system, all these beautiful things to help bring down that energy excitement and bring you into a state of being able to observe. So if you've never really meditated before, I just want to do a little bit of a practice. The key here is that the chest is up, the abdomen is open. And when I'm taking a breath, I'm going to be breathing from my abdomen. It's like I'm pushing downward, and that downward is going into my abdomen and it's pushing out. If you're not used to doing abdominal breathing or belly breathing, it can be a little bit not intuitive. A lot of people, especially when you are used to having strong emotions, they'll breathe very shallowly because it's just, I don't know, it fits more with the rhythm. I don't want to impose, but if you're not being used to being relaxed, you're going to have trouble with breathing deeply. And a lot of people who are really mental will also not breathe well. And so we want to engage our bodies and be belly breathing. There's a lot of different ways to do meditation. You can't really do it wrong as long as you're engaging your abdominal, like breathing with your diaphragm. Then you can breathe through your nose, you can breathe through your mouth, you can make a really long out breath, but try not to move your shoulders and keep your abdominals, like you can put your hand on your belly and push out on your hand when you're breathing in. If it's very difficult, it is a lot easier to belly breathe when you're lying down. So you can just give that a try. I will often do this kind of meditation just to kind of to get in touch with myself before bed, and it is a great way to fall asleep, actually. So it's a way you can practice um, mindfulness breathing there. If you don't do anything else, mindfulness breathing is extremely relaxing, and it kind of brings you back into the now because you're paying attention to your breath. And gives you more oxygen. It gives you just like that, like I said, the engagement with the rest and relax part of your nervous system. And it will help keep you in connection with your physical self. During an emotional release, I would say it's easy to come out of relaxing state. So remembering to go back to the breath, ground, keep yourself in your safe space. It's really helpful for being able to hold and maintain the entire emotional release. Even if you don't do it in one shot, you can still gain a lot from the breathing. It's like, so let's say it's too much, you have to stop, you stop and you can go back. And this practice will kind of deepen over time. The first time you do a full big emotional release, it will probably surprise you with how short it is. So anyway, so I'm gonna have holding our space, keeping like meditative breathing. So I just want to kind of go through the whole emotional release process. So the situation is you've been triggered. Something has upset you. You can, like, the anger may be coming, the panic may be coming, the freezing may be coming, the need to cry. And normally what I find people do is that they just do their best to start suppressing. So it's bad because I'm having an emotion. It's bad. I need to stop this. I need to suppress. And so what we're going to do instead is face, embrace, and release. So the first thing for facing it is we need to acknowledge that we're having an emotion. We need to not try to suppress it. And we need to go and get ourselves into a safe space so we can start holding space for our feelings. So embracing, we breathe and we allow that emotion to come up. And we watch to see how the body reacts and changes. We're trying to step away from the emotion, step away from labeling the emotion, and more being about watching the body, feeling sensations that are physical, like that tightness in the throat, or like you can feel crying come up, kind of like the welling of tears is a very physical sensation. The anger may be coming up, and you may be feeling the tightness in the jaw. So we want to kind of really keep in mind that we're going to watch rather than think. One of the things that can happen when you start thinking emotions, it can cause a downward spiral. The downward spiral for me is when you start remembering and adding more to the plate of your feelings, all of the other times that you were really feeling this emotion before. So like, oh, this came up then, oh, this is related to this. And the pile of dung that you're dealing with becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And the emotional reaction isn't really going to stop. And you're just piling it on and there's really no end. And so that is the downward spiral. To avoid that, we go back to that breath. We got back to observing the feelings because we're not trying to think about anything. We're just watching the body experience an emotion physically. So we're going to invite ourselves to feel that emotion. And sometimes you have to reach for it. Like, let's say you weren't able to get to that safe space right at the moment of the trigger and it's a few hours later, but you still really need to release it. You can go back to that time, remember that emotion during that experience and actively reach for it. I kind of visualize myself walking down a hallway, getting closer to that feeling. And you're watching your body react to that trigger again. But this time you're in your safe space and you've created like your breathing. So you're holding the space for your feelings. And then you're going to be able to let that emotion become stronger and stronger until the anger or the crying releases. And you're watching, you're not being. This is a lot less stressful. You're just watching, oh, my body is reacting. I'm seeing that like this is making me cry. And that watching stops that suppressing, stops the need to label, and lets the emotion just kind of come over in a wave. I like to think of crying as well, there's different kinds of crying, but for the most part, it's like a blockage coming out. It doesn't have to mean anything. Like you don't have to know where this crying is coming from. It really isn't the time to think about why you're having this feeling. It's the time to just release the feeling. You can ask your mind or your body for a summary afterwards. I find that that's like the way to get the mind out of the way is like, look, I'm going to go out of the way, but I want to know what happened when this is all over. And that's usually, and like when you're done, you will know why it happened, and you will get a sense of what's going on. And sometimes actually you don't care at all. And that's even better because it means you've completely let it go, which is wonderful and ideal. So trying to get to that point where we can comfortably release. So, like I said, it's often crying, but the body can release in many ways. Sometimes it's giggling or yawning, burping, needing to stretch, and sometimes like farting. For real, it happens. And so, but most of the time, it is with a stronger emotion. It is crying, or like the question before, an angry outburst. The idea is to get the suppression habits put aside. Like you can let yourself ugly cry, you can make weird noises, and like as long as you're not harming yourself or someone else and you're doing it in a healthy way, you can release even anger, like maybe screaming into a pillow, like that kind of thing is totally fine as long as you are, like I said, doing it in a healthy way. And the fun odd part about all of this is that this is like a really short process. The release process, the build up to the release can be quite a lot, but the actual release itself, like the worst of it is like 2 to 5 minutes. I swear I've had many times, like I worked with a client for 6 months. We were getting past this really big fear block of hers. She finally was able to release it. 6 months. In 2 minutes, it was over. It was beautiful and it was the release that she needed, but it was like, wow, like that's it. All right. So that's like in some ways a really nice blessing that you know that like it feels like you're totally out of control. It feels very scary, but it's really, really short. The worst of it will be done like uh less time than you really have time to blow your nose a couple times. It'll be a loud, ugly affair, and then it's over. It's like a summer storm. It's like, wow, that was a lot of rain, but everything's back to normal now. And so that's really the important part about the holding space, is that during those 2 to 5 minutes, it is intense or uncomfortable or just a little bit overwhelming. I wouldn't say emotional release is fun or comfortable. That's probably why a lot of people don't do it, but it's very short. So if you can get yourself to that point of feeling safe to be in a place of vulnerability for that brief time, it will be very impactful. So sometimes holding space isn't really something you can do alone, and it is really helpful to have someone there with you, especially when you're not used to releasing emotions. Like a psychologist, social worker, someone with counseling training is probably ideal, but a friend who is a really good listener and is really good at not giving advice or controlling the situation can also be really vital. Once you've kind of done it a couple times, you kind of get I guess, a sense of the whole like process, and you're not necessarily going to be intimidated by it. So it becomes easier to do alone. And the release itself, I'd like to say that there's two waves to it. Then the release itself, the really big, ugly cry part, I'd call it the first wave. And generally, if we were to think about it as climbing Pain Mountain, we have only gotten to the peak. So we've gotten to the important part of Pain Mountain. And this is usually where people, when they're finished their like first wave of emotions, they'll go, oh, okay, I feel better. And then they shut it down and it's over. And while it might be over in the I can't control myself anymore, I would say that that's not a full release. And this is the part that I think is like maybe a little bit new for a lot of people. So in the second wave, you're actually dealing with the undercurrent and the unconscious component, the thing that if you don't leave it, it will stew and grow over time and perhaps lead to another trigger later. So this second release can take a lot longer than 5 minutes. It can take, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes days. And being in this state of almost fully released, it's a little bit vulnerable. And I think that's a lot of people may want to suppress, but it's not nearly as intense and you can just ignore it. But I think holding the space, you don't have to like ignore the rest of your life at this point. It's more that you're in some part of your back of your mind, you're leaving a space for that emotion to continue processing. And it's more like I'm observing the fact that I'm still releasing. It's not necessarily going to jump out at you like the first wave does. So you can kind of know when you're done the second wave, when you kind of get bored. I think I'm good. I'm ready to move on. And if you think about that original trigger, it's kind of like your reaction is very neutral, or the trigger itself is like, it's almost like a picture that goes out of saturation and it's not very vivid anymore. So I would say that when you have a neutral reaction to the original trigger, then you have reached the second wave and you've done more of a complete and full release. So what is the benefit of this extra long process? And I would say everything, because unless you do a full release, you may not actually be getting past the thing that's bothering you in the first place. You might be just putting it off for the next time you can get triggered, like pent up over time, growing over time, and then it just comes back and haunts you once again. And we want to move to a point where we're growing and becoming our full selves. So I want to move past that. So this extra full release it just feels lighter in the chest. There's less going on. There's less, I guess, in the space. In some ways, that's where you can feel the happiness again. And it's just, everything is brighter and things are more comfortable. And I guess self-care during this whole process, like during the first wave, it's very short, you're in the moment, but afterwards, you don't really know how long you're going to be there. Holding space for yourself by allowing yourself to continue feeling is really important, but so is hydrating yourself, giving yourself kind of less mentally taxing things. If you're in the middle of a release, it's really not the time to do your taxes, or unless you find accounting relaxing. But the things that, like big decisions, maybe put those off, finding a chance to do something creative, maybe doing something just like in nature, being aware that like this stage generally feels kind of cruddy. I feel like somebody in a second stage may be moody, maybe sulky, a little bit melancholy, feeling off, all good symptoms that you're not quite finished the process yet. So the I feel done comes, and then I guess the recovery period, you feel a little bit more extra sensitive, a little bit more fragile. I would avoid stressful things like big gatherings during that time. I find it takes about a day and a half of being sensitive after a really big release to kind of feel solid again and go back to your normal. Before I go on, is there any questions about the process?
Um, so there were two questions about things that you had mentioned earlier. So one of them was, what do you think about the breathing techniques in which you count while breathing? Because you talked earlier about breathing from the belly.
Well, counting while breathing is perfectly helpful. It kind of helps people from having to do too much thinking. When I was doing some meditation, that's it's you're just trying to learn how to get out of your head, and counting is a great way to bring yourself into the present moment. So it's a great technique.
Okay, and the other question is, I haven't been able to cry in years. How can I let it out?
Well, you're asking probably for your body and you to like develop a relationship again, because in some ways you're probably gotten into the habit of suppressing that. So I would start with approximations. You're not necessarily going to cry the first time, but you're going to be bothered or annoyed or frustrated, and let yourself maybe feel, especially in the areas where crying happens, like in the chest, in the throat, in the nose. Um, and you're just going to feel the feelings of the body rather than the necessarily the crying. I mean, when you're looking at long-term suppression, you kind of have to get there through approximation. So after a bit, it's going to be easier. Let's say you're just afraid to cry at this point, so you kind of have to work on a couple of the other blocks that are in the way to crying. There is it's not part of today's talk, but like you can add other techniques. Like some people use tapping, I use acupuncture, and that kind of just helps the body get in control a little bit more. Like the body with acupuncture, it just kind of sidesteps mental blocks, and you're just able to kind of use those techniques to work through stuff like that as well. If it's really blocked, adding more tools to the tool chest helps with that.
And there was another comment. If you can talk a little bit more about like the first wave and the second wave, can you review that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I have come to find, like, I'm big on like the bell curve. So if you have ever taken statistics, like the bell curve is really helpful for visualizing kind of the wave in some ways, but at the same time, I also think about percent of release. So when I watch people in sessions, we get to this point where we're able to release. They're able to hold their safe space, and then this emotion comes up. Like let's say we're talking about parents, and it makes them cry. The point is to get past that point where it can hurt them again. And physically, the body needs extra time to process. Maybe this is another way to look at it. So I like to think about it as in two sentences. The statements kind of indicate where I am in the release, but I am trying to get to that point where my body has fully let go. And when I reach the first wave, I feel better. The mind cuts off the remaining part of the physical release. So in some ways, the physical body is the densest part of ourselves, and it's also the one that takes the longest in order to do any kind of personal change. So that extra time is really important for the body to finish processing, and the mental cues, like we can stop ourselves mentally at the point of I feel better, but we should wait till we get to the point of I don't really need to do this anymore. I hope that's helpful. Like you're looking at it more that the mental cutoff and the suppression tactics can engage now that the intense emotion is over. But I want you to keep going until the emotion is kind of like you're neutral about it and you don't really need to do it anymore. Um, you just sulk until sulking becomes boring. And then you're like, I don't really feel like doing this anymore. I'd like to do something else. And that is when you've kind of gotten to the point your physical body has finished letting everything out. Now I kind of want to talk a little bit about blocks in order, perfect segue, blocks to releasing. We as adults are complicated. There are a lot of things that come and go with working on ourselves, but kids are super easy. They drop their toys, they're upset and they cry about it. The toys are picked up and they're fine. We as adults try to suppress and look good for the way the cultural norms expect us to. So I'm not supposed to cry, so I have to stop myself from crying, but I'm annoyed that I want to cry. So you have this block of your release that may in itself need to be looked at as well. So one of the big blocks that can really come up with, especially in abuse, is forgiveness. Why do you want to forgive somebody who hurt you? I want to hate them. And that is a block that I want to talk about first, that it isn't them we're hurting by holding in that anger. So that in itself is the reason we want to forgive, because we want to give ourselves that gift back of being happy again. But sometimes it's just a little bit hard to process. So we want to see the benefit of it. And that can help us with the block of trying to do the emotional release around it. I would say that the most obvious and the most common problem with forgiveness is people think forgiveness is forgetting, that you let that person off the hook. There's nothing that they are responsible for anymore. And that is not at all what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not holding yourself as the place where that has to be. It's kind of I am not responsible for that. And I'm not going to hold anger or pain for that because it's not mine. I don't need to be the one holding that anymore. I don't know. I looked it up and it's not actually a Buddha phrase, but the phrase that really helps typify the detriment of holding on to anger is like holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So you're helping yourself. This person is not off the hook. That's not how life works. Whatever your belief system works, that's not how. They're not off the hook, but you don't need to be the one holding them on that. You can be free from this and move forward. So I want you to see this as let's say an extra step. So we're going to visualize that person or that pain. You don't have to visualize the person. You can just visualize the pain, and you're giving that pain away. And you don't need to be angry at that person because it's holding you from getting better. I don't even think it really is the same thing for them at all. So we need to see forgiveness as being a gift to ourselves. And when we forgive, we can release anger towards a person. We can release any kind of negative feelings towards what happened, and that we're freeing ourselves from that. Forgiveness is like an energy technique. You're not giving someone a pardon for something that they did that was incorrect. That's not how it works. Forgiveness when I've done it for myself, is becoming neutral to someone and not letting their presence or their memory hurt me. And I find that that's really the beauty of using. So it's a very, very powerful tool. So if we can move past the idea that forgiveness is forgetting, then we can use that beautiful tool in the whole emotional release process. I like to think that forgiveness can come out kind of on its own. You have to forgive before you can then join into the emotional release, or it can kind of extend the emotional release process. It looks if you don't kind of connect with it with the way I've explained it, it might be helpful to journal about it and maybe talk about it with a counselor or someone, because there's benefits that you are going to gain from having this outside of you. I have worked with abuse victims before where we did a forgiveness process, but the visual was kind of neutral. We chose to visualize her washing herself from this person's energy. And that was really helpful for her. She just pictured this lovely, fluffy pink soap, and it cleaned all of the parts of her. And she didn't have to engage in the actual person directly or in the memory of them directly. So um, that's the other really interesting thing about emotional release via physical process is the memories and reliving them is not really necessary. The physical acknowledgement of the process is more where you're focused on. So you don't have to relive anything. You're just letting your body finish processing some of these things on a physical level. Another block that I'd like to just kind of bring up is shame. I consider shame to be a powerful blocker for emotional release. Shame is probably one of the stronger ones that I've seen. You kind of want to protect yourself from it, but at the same time, it can both stop you from trying to release, but it really shows up during emotional release. So, like I said, that roller coaster that holding space is really helpful for. Shame can really derail in an emotional release. So you're really trying to just like take those "I'm stupid, this is embarrassing, I don't need to do this, I'm wrong too," all of these, I guess, self-hatred phrases can come up in an emotional release. And we're just trying to acknowledge that we're having them without having to stop the process. So the breath can be really helpful for this. You know, what are you going to do during those things? And the breath, you can breathe them away. I really like to imagine my mind is like a sky, and those intrusions are like clouds. And then I'm just like letting those clouds go away. Or one actually really helps for me is like they're like birds that are fluttering nearby, and I'm like, go away. And I let them flutter and fly away. I picture, you know, when pigeons run away, they take off when you run too close, like that flurry of leaving. So those intrusive thoughts, I'm letting go rather than believing. Um, it's sometimes this is like these kind of really big blocks are like really why safe spaces and like helpers for safe spaces like therapists are really, really key, because you may be having trouble stopping yourself from thinking those things, and you need that person outside of yourself being like, you're doing great. Bring your breath, keep breathing, listen to my voice, remember that we're in a safe space. And like that outside force can help when it's a really strong one. And like I said, though, if you can get to a point where you're feeling more used to this process, then you are able to be objective for yourself and keeping and maintaining that space during the release. Not a lot of the time do you need to do anything other than observe. So this whole process is about maintaining that space. There's other blocks, of course, like I think self-sabotage is a really common one. I don't have time to do this. I'm busy. Different, like I'm busy with this person. I had to help this person instead. And all of these things are just different blocks. And if you can talk through those blocks or talk to yourself and label them as blocks, you can kind of get a sense of, well, do I want to release? And if you're not really comfortable with doing the full process, like I said, you can practice each process separately and getting comfortable with each by itself. And you can even do practice runs with smaller emotions, like mini releases. So something that is bothering you from like an altercation at work and you're upset by, but it's by no means the thing that normally sends you to being like strongly upset. You can just do this process with something that's a little bit more safer. and you can get the experience and the comfort with seeing that. And that will still actually help with the larger things. In some ways, it's like you're chipping away, but each chip is still a piece that is no longer part of that big emotional block. It's all about being ready. And I don't want anyone to think that, oh, well, I'm not able to do that, so I'm a failure and I can't release my emotions. It's about being ready. I'd like to think that any attempt is going to be providing you with something, and it's a, you know, a big accomplishment in and of itself. And I like the idea of taking the a concept of emotions from being a generally mental practice of labeling and with words and like justifying, and moving it into that level of the physical, using more sensations and feelings in the body to explain them, and of seeing that emotional movement being a more automatic process that we observe rather than direct. So we create this safe space. We're able to feel safe, relax, let that tension go, and let that energy flow throughout the body, and let that just finish processing. When we can be more objective, get ourselves to that calmer place after the full release. So we're all the way up to Pain Mountain and off Pain Mountain, and we can say goodbye to that whole process and that whole trigger. So just imagine what your life would be after being able to do that several times with a few really strong emotions. How would your quality of life be? I invite everyone to try this technique in parts or in total, and just let yourself begin healing and processing and bring yourself to a new level and better version of yourself. So that's my full talk for today. And thank you very much for being here for me. And I'm thankful for this opportunity. So is there any other questions?
There are a few more questions. So someone said, I go through my assault in my mind step by step. I'm scared to forget the details. If I heal from my trauma, will I forget it?
Like, I think that it's important to think about what memories and emotional valence on the memories are not the same thing. You will not forget what happened. But you will probably have a different relationship with what happened, which is ideal, which is what we want to do, because we don't want to be reliving these things anymore. You will not forget. It's not like your memory editing, your emotional processing. So emotions connect really well to memories. That's what the vividness effect is. But we're just trying to get that vividness to go away. The memories won't leave. You won't forget what happened. It will just not something that brings itself to the surface and your current self on a regular basis. You'll move past it.
Is there a place we can get a list of the most common areas where you would feel emotions in your body?
When I was talking earlier about metaphysics, you can Google that term. There's a lot of books on that. My favorite is Lise Bourbeau. I guess I could add that into you. Do you know how to spell her name? It's not Boudreau, it's Bourbeau. And okay, I'll do it. But I'll do that in a second when we finish the question. So all of these people have kind of outlined what they feel is the most common themes that come with, yeah, that's the correct spelling. So the common themes with certain body areas, I like to call that a book of hints. You don't need to be fast and true that this is what happens in this body area. I like Lise Bourbeau because she has a section in the back where you can customize. If you don't get the kind of connection to her explanation, you can make your own. And that's what you're trying to do, is put words to these sensations so your mind can understand them better. So yeah, the whole field of metaphysics is a great, it's a little bit like astrology, and the way that it like may not apply to you. And the point is, it is a tool. If you don't connect with it, please use a different tool.
And a last question, can you talk about how acupuncture helps with healing?
Well, I I could probably do another whole lecture on how acupuncture helps with healing. But when it comes to how it can help someone get to a point for like being able to cry, like when I was speaking before. So what the body is doing is like reacting to like all these external stimuli, and through, I guess, the command of the mind. The mind kind of has the ability to tell the body what to do. And the body is, in general, its default is to heal. So that's why we observe rather than dictate, because the body doesn't need our help. But if it's been a long time and you're really disconnected with that process, acupuncture, well, certain acupuncture styles can really kind of get that relaxing brought back. I'd like to think about it as it reminds you what relaxing feels like. It brings you back to that ability to be free flowing and relaxing, and the emotional processes can restart again after having, let's say, a disruption from a long habit of not being able to. Sometimes the acupuncture point itself can be, it's a very specific kind of painful. And I know it's going to be an emotional release painful, because like that, like inserting a needle is not painful. They're very little. If I don't put it in a spot that it needs it, you don't feel it at all. But when you need it, I actually have caused an emotional release with going to put a needle in a spot. So I was going to put the needle in a spot. She had this reaction. I'm like, that's an emotional release reaction. And instead I did acupressure instead. And she cried. It was a beautiful release. And then I afterwards said, I bet I could put that needle in that spot and it wouldn't upset you. And she's like, no, it's fine now. So it's kind of like the floodgates in some ways. It opens up blockages that sidestep like mental control. The body wants to heal. So when you use acupuncture, it kind of brings that up.
I'm gonna launch the polling now, but Elena, can you talk a little bit more about like how we can reach you? Like how does it work to like make appointments with your business?
Oh yeah. Right now I'm doing mostly in-person appointments, but I am in the future going to be launching an online version of this where it's more like mentoring and one-on-one. But generally you get in touch with me at my website, easternspirit.ca, or you can find me on Facebook at Eastern Spirit. Acupuncture, I'm in Shediac. You can look me up on Google like with Shediac Acupuncture. I'm pretty sure that I'm the main person who shows up. Me and my husband both practice acupuncture, my focus being on trauma, but we can do all kinds of things. Like a lot of people come to us with pain, and that pain has a traumatic root. So when the person's open, I will kind of work on both. So both the pain goes away and the emotion goes away, and they just have a higher quality of life. So yeah, I'm able to be found in the phone book as well. So it would be wonderful if anyone wants to reach out for a bit more information. I'd love to do kind of this stuff more often. I am in the future looking to provide more like group sessions where I kind of teach these techniques. But I'm currently only doing one-on-one sessions from my office right now.
And tomorrow I will be sending out an email with your information. So if ever someone wanted to book a session with you, then they would have all that information. And also, so Elena has prepared for all the participants French and English handout about, I think it was specifically about the holding space concept.
Well, it just what the process looks like. I didn't put a lot about the background on the emotion theory. It was just more what the process is in itself. So it's a quick guide on some of the steps of like the face, embrace, release.
Okay, perfect.
Wonderful.
Well, Elena, thank you so much. This was really interesting and really informative. So right now I'm going to end the session. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Take care. Have a great night.